All right. I start to see the numbers starting to leveling off of people joining. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome. I'm Dr. Ed Kearns. I'm the Chief Science Officer here at First Street, where we connect climate risk to financial risk. And we're doing so at the asset-specific level, very property-specific level. And today we're hosting a discussion on hurricanes. It's hurricane season. It's on everybody's mind. And so we'll be talking about hurricanes today. We'll talk about hurricanes. You may hear us talk about tropical cyclones. That's the same thing. So we may use the terminology interchangeably, but our focus is going to be the impacts of climate change on hurricanes on the U.S. East Coast and U.S. Gulf Coast in particular. And so, yeah, like I said, it is hurricane season. It is upon us. A lot of us are thinking about this, and we need to be prepared. So this hopefully will help you understand how climate change is impacting your risk from hurricanes. So some logistics, a recording of this panel discussion will be made afterwards, made available afterwards. During the course of this discussion, if you want to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions to us, we will be leaving some time at the end of the panel discussion today to answer your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible before our time is up. So that said, let's dive in. So why are we interested in this? Well, by NOAA's measure, there have been about $360 billion weather disasters since 1980. That's in U.S. Adjusted dollars, 24 adjusted dollars. So 62 of those billion-dollar events have been tropical cyclones or hurricanes, and these hurricanes have caused the most damage of any type of extreme event. Over $1.3 trillion in damage over that time, with an average cost per hurricane of $22.8 billion. So very, very impactful, very expensive. Hurricanes are also responsible for the highest number of deaths among these extreme events, with over 7,000 people who lost their lives since 1980. So today we're going to focus on how climate change is impacting the risk from hurricanes and on the associated financial losses that can be expected. So let me introduce our esteemed panelists today. I have some short bios here that I will read. It is very hard to summarize the careers of our esteemed panelists today in just a few words, but I will try. Let's start with Dr. Kerry Emanuel. Dr. Kerry Emanuel is a professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's been on the faculty of MIT since 1981. He specializes in hurricane physics and was the first to investigate how long-term climate change might affect hurricane activity. Dr. Emanuel is the author or co-author of over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers and over 700 entries in Google Scholar with 72,000 citations of Dr. Emanuel's work. He's also written 3 books, including Divine Wind, The History and Science of Hurricanes, which is written for a general audience, and What We Know About Climate Change. He's co-director of MIT's Lorenz Center, a climate think tank devoted to climate research. And Dr. Emanuel was elected a member of the U.S. National Academies of Science back in 2007. And we're very lucky here at First Street because Dr. Emanuel has served as an advisor to us since 2018. Phew, hard to follow that one, Dr. Cosson, but Dr. Jim Cosson is next. Dr. Cosson specializes in climate risk and extreme weather events such as hurricanes, and serves today as a distinguished science advisor to First Street, and is still affiliated with the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Cosson works for 13 years at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, formerly the National Climatic Data Center, where I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Cosson as a colleague a couple years ago. He has published over 250 papers in a broad range of peer-reviewed journals, including Nature, Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and even New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Cosson was a lead author on the 2021 United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. You may have heard about that body many times before if you're interested in climate change. On the 6th Assessment Report, so-called AR6, and also the 2013 AR5, and the 2012 IPCC Special Report on Extremes. And then also on the domestic U.S. National Climate Assessment, which comes out about every 4 years, also a lead author for that. Among the numerous accolades Dr. Cosson has received, he received the 2021 NOAA Administrators Award. That's NOAA's highest award for the scope and impacts of his research on tropical cyclones over the course of his career. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Jeremy Porter. First Street Dr. Jeremy Porter is the head of climate implications here. where he leads First Street's research around the social and economic impacts of climate risk and exposure. Dr. Porter has published over 130 peer-reviewed articles, numerous white papers and reports, and 3 books in the field of spatial statistics. Dr. Porter came to First Street in 2017 from academia, where he held positions as professor and founding director of the Quantitative Methods in the Social Sciences program at the Sydney University of New York, and spent over a decade on the faculty at Columbia University as well. He also served as the founding editor-in-chief of the academic journal Spatial Demography and the founding editor of Springer's book series. Well, our panelists today, names today, we'll drop the doctors, we'll drop the formality for now, but and we'll plow ahead. So, questions for our panelists. So, jumping to the answer to the question of how is climate change likely to affect hurricanes? So, it could be the strength of the storms, the number of the storms, the tracks of the storms in the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, and then we'll circle back on how we know this. But let's get to the answer first for our audience. So how is climate change likely to affect hurricanes? Let's start with Carrie.
Well, there are things that we are fairly confident about and other things that we're not confident at all about in terms of how climate change is likely to affect hurricanes. What we have known for perhaps the longest time is that as you warm the oceans and the atmosphere, the thermodynamic potential for strong hurricanes increases. So we expect to see stronger hurricanes than we used to see as the climate warms. And the destructive power of the wind goes up quite quickly with wind speed. It's like the cube of the wind. So that's an important consideration. The other thing that we're fairly confident about, which is perhaps more consequential even than the wind increase, is that as the atmosphere warms, there can be much more moisture. There will be much more moisture in it, and that means much heavier rains. What many don't know is that most of the time it's water that kills people and does a lot of damage as opposed to wind. So we're very worried and concerned about increases in rainfall and also potential increases in the strength of storm surges. What we are far less confident about is the number or frequency of hurricanes. And that may be very specific to the particular part of the world you're talking about. The frequency of hurricanes is very sensitive to the pattern of warming, not just the amplitude of it. So we're watching that, but at the moment we don't have a strong consensus on how that might change.
Thank you, Carrie. Jim, do you have any thoughts to particularly on the tracks or number of storms too?
Yes, yeah. To add to what Carrie has already mentioned, I mean, we do concentrate quite a bit on intensity and frequency, and the intensity would be wind intensity and also rainfall intensity, both of which Carrie touched on. Another really important aspect of how climate change is affecting hurricanes is through their tracks. And that can be where they track, and it can also be how quickly they track. How fast are they moving from one spot to another? When you think about rainfall on the ground, the increases in rain rates are most certainly increasing rainfall on the ground, all other things being equal. But the way to really get a lot of rainfall on the ground is to have a storm move very slowly or stall. And of course, Houston experienced that with Hurricane Harvey to amazing extent. And also in the Bahamas, Hurricane Dorian was a terrifying example of what happens when a hurricane stalls. So I think that we need to also very importantly consider how tracks are changing and how that might well, it certainly changes the risk landscape and how that might increase risk, especially in places that historically may not have been exposed to that many hurricanes. And so they may not be quite so resilient or they're more vulnerable to them.
Great. For the number of storms, a lot of people think, as Carrie was mentioning, that with the increased sea surface temperatures and air temperatures, it increases the intensity. What's the impact on the number of storms, or can we discern the number of storms? Is there a clear signal, like can we expect more storms or less storms, or is this still something that we're researching?
If that's directed toward me, I'm sure that Kerry will give a very similar answer. And he did mention that that's unfortunately a place where we have less certainty and less consensus. The physics of tropical cyclogenesis, what the factors are that allow them to form, are a little bit less clear or less easy to define than some of the other aspects, like how strong a storm can get in a particular environment. Because of a lot of Kerry's earliest work in this, we have a pretty good idea of what these limits are to how strong the winds can get. But in terms of the factors for them forming, we have less certainty. And in terms of how climate change is affecting those factors, we have less certainty. So I think the short answer to your question, Ed, is that we're not sure. There's certainly studies that suggest an increase in the number with warming, and there's studies that suggest no change, and even some that suggest a decrease. So I think the important thing to think about in terms of climate change and hurricanes is we have a lot more confidence knowing what the effects are once a storm has formed. When you have a storm, now we have a lot of confidence to say it's more likely to have stronger winds, more likely to rain more likely to move more slowly, more likely to move further northward or southward in the southern hemisphere.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for that summary. Yes. So one of the questions would be that, as you said, is active area research, is how do we know this? And on the screen right now, our viewers on the webinar are looking at a plot of historical storms on the left-hand side from NOAA, and the right-hand side they're seeing a whole bunch of more tracks. And Carrie, I was wondering if you could explain the technique that you have pioneered over the last couple of decades of examining synthetic hurricanes. And people who visit the First Street website will read about the fact that we're using these kinds of synthetic hurricanes in our analysis. Could you explain a little bit about what a synthetic hurricane is and how it's used in analysis to find the answers to these questions that we're asking today? Oh, I think you're on mute, Carrie.
Sorry, I'm happy to have a shot at that. The underlying problem that we're trying to address here is that history is too short and in many ways too flawed. We have done all kinds of analyses that suggest that if you want to have, for example, a robust estimate of property value loss in the entire eastern United States from hurricanes, even if the climate were not changing at all, you'd need about 1,000 years of data. Well, we don't have anything like that. So there is another way of knowing about the world, which is through physics. And physics has been very successful in other arenas. So almost every weather forecast you hear beyond about 6 hours from now is going to be based upon a physical model of the atmosphere. We call that a weather prediction model. So we know the physics of the atmosphere well enough to do this. Now, in the case of tropical cyclones, it's very tricky because you have to have a very, very high resolution model, much higher than it's normally used, for example, for climate projections. And that's very expensive. So what we've learned to do over the last few decades is an exercise called downscaling, where we take a fairly coarse-grained output of, say, climate models or climate analyses, and we embed in that time-evolving state many proto-vortices, which move with the large-scale flow provided by the climate analysis or climate model. And once we have the track of the storm, we run a very detailed hurricane model along the track, which predicts whether and how much the storm will intensify decay. When we do that, we find that almost all of the seeds, we call them, that we put down die because they've been put in the wrong environment. And so it's kind of a natural selection process. And the survivors constitute the climatology of tropical cyclones for that climate state as simulated by a climate model or as analyzed in a climate analysis. And it works quite well. If we do this for the present climate, you get very good correspondence between the statistics of these synthetic hurricanes and those of real hurricanes. But we can generate 100,000 storms and get very much more robust ideas of the actual hazard posed by hurricanes. The model also predicts rainfall and can be coupled to something called a surge model to predict the storm surges along the coastlines, which are in practice one of the most destructive and deadly aspects of the storm. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing.
Thank you. I'll go back to Jim, building upon this. So now, as Carrie was explaining, now we've got thousands of hurricane tracks to work with on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we've only got a couple handfuls, and luckily Cat 5s, for example, the strongest hurricanes, landfalling Cat 5s, are very rare. So this is a good thing, right, for us. But so Jim, how do you work across the observational period of record into the synthetic hurricanes that Carrie has created? How do you generate statistics that actually help inform these questions that we have about hurricane behavior?
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly form statistics with the observations, but as Carrie mentioned, only to a point, because actually for storms over the conterminous United States, we have some confidence going all the way back to 1900. So we do have a little bit more data in that particular region of the world, or reliable data, I should say. But regardless, there's never going to be enough for the level of robust statistics that we get using these synthetic tracks. There's gaps that need to be filled in. For example, just because a region never experienced a track within the data that we have, again, going back to say 1900, does not mean that they can't. And so the synthetic tracks show you all the potential possibilities, and not just where they are, but how strong they are, how much rainfall is coming out of them. And then, as Carrie mentioned, the statistics of the observed hurricanes are in very good alignment with the statistics of the synthetic hurricanes. It's just more robust with the synthetic hurricanes.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. So we've had a question coming that's kind of along the line of forecasting that Carrie was just talking about. So let me turn to this question that just came in. So one of our viewers says that they've read that NOAA has asked for more powerful computational resources to improve their forecasting accuracy, the kind of weather models that Carrie was just describing. The question is this still true? What's different, between what we're talking about here and what First Street is doing and what NOAA, for example, is doing with the federal government? Jim, do you want to handle that as a former NOAA employee?
Sure. Now we're talking about two very different types of modeling. The real-time forecast models require enormous computational resources. Then they're getting better and better, faster and faster, and finer resolution. The physics is improving. It's a true success story. So those are terrific for forecasting on the order of days to maybe 10 days or something like that. We can't run those models on the kind of time periods necessary for finding slowly emerging trends due to climate change. So it really is kind of an apples and oranges. Now, that being said, in addition to the kind of downscaling that Carrie's method is using to create these synthetic tracks, there's also what we call explicitly simulated hurricanes, where a model based on physics is at a fine enough resolution that it actually produces hurricanes within itself, within the physics of the model. Those you need very high resolution to model a Category 5 hurricane, and we're starting to tickle that now, with reasonable resources. So I guess the short answer to that question, the shorter answer is that, yes, absolutely. We need more resources for real-time forecasting. There's also, we need more resources for studying climate change on hurricanes, but they're sort of two different levels of study.
All right, thank you for that, and thank you for the person who asked the question. So what we've heard is that we're likely to see stronger hurricanes, higher intensity hurricanes that are going to be bringing with them more rain, more surge, moving slowly over land, which could increase the amount of damage. So what is and Jeremy, I have not come to you yet, so we've been talking physics, but now we're coming down to the effects of this physics, how it's going to be impacting our country. So what's the likely effect of having these stronger storms on hurricane risk for the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks, Ed, and thanks, Jim and Carrie, for setting up the stage for what we're doing. And we borrow both on the science, but then explicitly on the models that Carrie has created also in the development of our own models. And so what we've done, which I think speaks to the last question that was asked, is we're creating a risk model on the First Street side. So we're creating 50,000 synthetic tracks. We derive them under SSP 245, current and future conditions, and then we build from that 1 minute sustained wind fields that we're attaching to our data. And from that, we're also integrating things like land cover into the model. So we have drag coefficients built into the model to help to understand the actual impact of the hurricane risk itself at any given location where the hurricane tracks have an impact. And it ends up producing a model for speed and direction. So from there, we've been able to derive estimates associated with the actual risk of the hurricanes, built from the science, the physical-based models, and the synthetic tracks that both Jim and Carrie have contributed to. You can see on the slide now that's being shown, we're actually highlighting over time the increased risk as you move into the future and start to think about how these stronger storms that are moving further inland and causing more damage, what areas will start to impact. And I think one of the big questions that our other panelists can speak to also is that the areas that are generally exposed to hurricanes have been implementing for decades now building code adjustments. They've been implementing ways to protect communities from the risk. But when you start to see places like northern Alabama, southern Tennessee start to hit these sustained wind patterns, all of a sudden you start to worry about the housing stock that was built in these areas that wasn't prepared properly for the types of damages that could occur. We've already talked about the northward movement of the hurricane, so we're seeing more of that risk in our models in the northern mid-Atlantic, even into the southern New England areas. And I think the number one thing, Ed, that kind of highlights what you brought up earlier is that from NOAA, I mean, if we actually look at climate or inflation adjusted dollars, in the 1980s, we saw about $46 billion in damages from tropical cyclones. Just in the last 5 years, we've tracked $282 billion in damages. So the increasing wind speed, as Carrie pointed out, has an exponential impact on the damages and particularly in areas where we haven't built housing stock to be prepared for the risks that exist today and moving into the future.
So yeah, thank you, Jeremy. So with these more northward tracks and stronger storms, so we're seeing, and thanks to the resolution being afforded by Carrie's synthetic hurricane tracks that are being used in the First Street model. So what we're seeing in this figure is this penetration of risk further inland and further north than what we're used to. So Carrie, do you think this is how do we get this message out to, say, like New England, which has an emerging risk maybe higher than that they've had hurricanes in the past. So they like the 1938 hurricane famously impacted a lot of New England. Is that kind of risk? Is this something that we need to get the message out to homes and businesses in New England to be better prepared?
And yeah, we need to work very hard on that. I'm glad you asked the question. I would say place like New England is interesting because it doesn't have very frequent hurricanes. Every 100 or 150 years, it gets slammed with a very large storm. We had ones in 1635 and 1815 and 1938 were the big ones in New England. Even if the climate weren't changing, that's such a long interval that, you know, by now everyone practically has forgotten about the 1938 storm, which killed well over 600 people in New England. Now, of course, back then, there was literally no warning for that storm, none whatsoever. Everyone was caught off guard. But on the other hand, there is so much more to damage in New England now than there was then, that it's going to be a big problem. Now, if you add the problems of climate change, including increasing sea level, on top of that, you have a real problem. And getting people's attention to that isn't easy. But I think the more granular you can make estimates so that people are aware not just of the broad risk to the region of New England, but how much is their house at risk? How much is their neighborhood at risk? If you can do that, which is something First Street is doing, I think you stand a better chance of getting people's attention.
Thank you, Carrie. And Jim, I know you've been looking at these northern tracks, the shifts in losses with the more poleward or northward tracks of storms. Is there anything you'd like to comment on regarding, you know, how severe that shift is, or how that shift is impacting risks, say, you know, relative to Florida or the Mid-Atlantic states, or relative to New England that Carrie was just describing?
Yeah, again, I mean, these changes in track can have enormous ramifications, right? Certainly, changing the return periods in New England, you know, reducing them and perhaps increasing them in more southern areas. Now, the Atlantic is a very interesting ocean basin. It's fairly confined compared to, say, the Pacific, and it has a lot of regional things going on. Some of them seem to be internal, like the meridional overturning circulation. Gulf Stream is part of that's an ocean thing. Some aspect that actually Carrie has studied extensively and published on is some of the effects on ocean temperature due to reducing pollution in the region of the Atlantic, especially since the Clean Air Acts and amendments of the 70s. So you have a lot of regional, what we call forcing, or regional aspects that are sort of controlling track. So the reason I mention that is that in the observations, we see the greatest poleward shifts of these storms in other basins and less so in the Atlantic, but we feel that a lot of that is because there are some regional aspects over there that are somewhat countering the CO2 warming aspects of track shift. But Carrie has actually shown that if you project these track shifts out in the Atlantic, you really do start to see this northward component emerging fairly strongly into this century toward, say, 2100. And that's certainly going to have profound effects on, you know, exposures and impacts in the northern part of the conterminous U.S.
All right, thanks, Jim. Turning to Jeremy. So when you've got these shifting risks, you had mentioned some numbers before, but in particular, and we have a live question getting to this as well, is, you know, the compound effects of what Carrie and Jim are describing, of the higher winds, the higher surge, the increased rainfall. How do these things play together, and how does the current science and the modeling that's being done at First Street, how does this come together in terms of quantifying the risk? How can you bring these different things together to say what is the impact in dollars for the average homeowner or for an average business owner?
Yeah, so there are really two things. If we can go to the next slide, I think we can see the regional impacts. So these are some of the original impacts that we saw from our model. Oversimplified, of course, they're a lot more complex than this. But I mean, we found by applying the risk metrics to the properties and then applying actual damage functions, which I'll talk about next, to the risk that's associated with the properties, that we're seeing a huge increase in damages over the next 30 years based on what's there now in the New England area. We're seeing a big increase in wind speeds in the Mid-Atlantic. We actually saw in our physically based models in the Gulf Coast hurricanes that moved off the current scales for measuring hurricane speeds. That reminds me of a paper that Jim was a part of, I think within the last year, where potentially we need higher category rankings for some of these hurricanes. So and then in Florida, we're finding it's a combination both of development and risk, just an immense amount of expected damages in the area. And again, a lot of that has to be tied back to land use decisions that are made around where we live, where we develop, the structures that are developed in those areas, in the intersection of that development and risk. We only get these big damage function numbers in places where we've developed and there's large amounts of risk. But if we move into the next slide, on the First Street side, what we ultimately end up doing, and we do this with all of our different climate models, is we individualize and hyper localize the risk associated with whatever climate peril it is that we're looking at. So when you're looking at wind, we're locating the property specifically based on the property characteristics. We're interested in the building materials of the property. We're interested in the roof materials and construction materials associated with the property. One of the things that we built in collaboration with our partner, Arup, which is an environmental engineering firm that helps us to develop these damage functions using a cost estimation approach, where they actually go in based on local market values. They take information about all of the different components of the property. They take information around what's being damaged at different wind speeds for the different property types, and they'll build up an estimate of what a certain level of risk would cost on average annually each year, or what it would cost if we were to be hit by a certain type of windstorm. And one of the things they also introduce is the environment around which the property is located. So things like what was called the missile environment. What other types of objects in the area could cause damage to the property that aren't property specific? So we're building up these models specifically using a cost estimation approach and based on the property specific characteristics to help hyper localize the risk characteristics. And when you take all of that information, you can look at a single property, or you could bring it up into a portfolio analysis if you wanted to. If you were interested in understanding multiple homes, risk metrics, and how do we sort of understand the more holistically what the risk is for that portfolio. So you could imagine it being this type of approach being useful to a homeowner, an individual homeowner, whether they own a home, they're searching for a home, or to asset managers and others that hold a number of properties in their portfolios.
Jeremy, at First Street, I know we're considering the flood damage separately from the wind damage, and then we're adding those together. Of course, in the insurance market, and then we have a couple of questions online about insurance, and you said the state Florida, which of course always people talking about insurance. So let's talk about that a little bit, because we have these different modes of damage from wind and from water. And we've got the National Flood Insurance Program, which is undergoing some changes with Risk Rating 2.0. People, if you're a homeowner, you're probably familiar with the NFIP if you're living in a risky area. And then wind damage is something else, and the state of Florida has its own wind damage. So let me turn to Carrie and see, Carrie, do you have any comments about how this risk is evolving and the impact on the insurance market and the population, particularly in the state of Florida?
Yeah, it's a fascinating problem. You know, I have to say that if somebody asked me 20 years ago, what would be a boring profession to go into, I might have said insurance, and boy, did I turn out to be wrong. It's fascinating, and it's very complicated. So we're seeing very rapidly rising insurance rates in places like California because of wildfires and Florida because of hurricanes. And it's tempting to say that's all because finally the insurance industry has realized that there's something called climate change, but that's way too simplistic. One of the big factors in all of this is the way insurance is regulated. And in the United States, that insurance regulation has caused a lot of problems. And in a nutshell, people who live in risky areas agitate for lower insurance premiums, and the state, acting through insurance regulators often caps insurance premiums, which has the effect of subsidizing risk in risky places. And in addition to that, there's the federal flood insurance program, which historically has also charged very low premiums in risky places. Now, everyone's beginning to understand they can't afford that. Insurance companies go bankrupt. The federal government and the insurance program is deeply in debt. And so part of what we're seeing now is an adjustment, let's say a rationalization of insurance. The premiums are beginning to migrate to what they should be. And what they should be has increased because of climate change, but I would say most of the adjustment is just the realization by insurance and by governments that the risk all along was larger than what they were charging premiums for. Anyway, I could go on and on about this and bore everyone, but it is a fascinating and complex problem and a wonderful illustration of the complexity with which human beings are interacting with weather and climate.
Thank you, Carrie. And it is, I'm a native Floridian. I was born and raised in Miami, so the hurricane risk is near and dear to my heart. But our ability now as scientists to quantify this risk, I think, given the tools that we have today, many of which we're discussing today, is greater than it's ever been. So it's really spurring this discussion in a very informed way, which is fantastic. Let me go to Jim. So if I'm living in Florida and First Street just said, oh well, the chances of storms going further north are increasing. Does that mean that Florida is off the hook? Does that mean that Florida is going to see fewer hurricane losses into the future? Florida is always looking for some good news when it comes to hurricane risk.
Yeah, and it would be wonderful to be able to provide some good news. And I mean, I think that there is some good news in a northward shifting of these storms or storm tracks where the odds of being, impacted directly might decrease. But that being said, there's all these other perils associated with these storms. If their winds are getting stronger, their surges are getting taller, their rainfall is increasing, their forward speed might be decreasing, leading to much more impacts on the ground. Those things may be more than enough to offset any sort of shifting of these storms. And when we say that they're shifting, that doesn't mean, oh, no more storms are going to hit Florida, they're all going to hit New England. It's just a proportional thing. Out of the storms, there might be slightly fewer, but there's still going to be plenty of impacts in Florida. And unfortunately, as these storms are getting stronger and, as I mentioned, raining more, moving more slowly, the impacts are most likely going to increase. And lest we forget, we're talking about the physics of hurricanes here and climate change. But a huge aspect of this would be, the concentration of population and infrastructure and how that's growing. And then the last thing to be just a real Debbie Downer, we have sea level rise acting in the background. Right. So now our storm surges are sitting on top of sea level rise. So it's difficult to imagine that any place is going to see a reduction of overall risk, but there are certainly shifting patterns involved.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And Jeremy, I know you've run the numbers for Florida. So what's the net effect of this, everything that Carrie and Jim are describing for those viewers that happen to be in the state of Florida?
Yeah, I couldn't have been set up better. We have on the next slide, actually, we have one last slide for me on the insurance issue. So this is a report that we put out late last year where we were focused on an understanding of these properties that had been pushed to what we call residual insurance programs. Oftentimes, they're state-run or state-sponsored programs like the State Fair Plan in California, Citizens in Florida and Louisiana. And what we did is we actually ran the numbers to figure out how many properties had already been pushed on to these residual plans or had seen a big spike in their flood insurance due to the NFIP changing. And what we found was there's about 8 million properties that are already being impacted today. If you take those 8 million properties and you look at the risk profile associated with those properties, whether it be wind, flood, for the purposes of this webinar, but also fire on the West Coast and out west, we found there's almost 39 million properties that touch some part of that risk profile. That's about a quarter of all properties in the country have either wind risk, flood risk, or wildfire risk that exceeds what properties are already seeing that have seen spikes in their insurance due to recent NFIP changes or have been moved to residual insurance plans in their state. And as you can look at the map, you called out Florida. I believe I don't know that Rhode Island is completely covered there in our wind risk map. I think Florida is the only state that is about 100% covered in terms of being part of our insurance. What we're referring to as an insurance bubble. Really, it's properties that are at risk of insurance correction. Carrie made a really good point around the fact that it's not necessarily that all of a sudden we have all this climate risk that has to be priced in. It's been happening over time, and we haven't priced it in. The NFIP program is the easiest program because it's the most public. We can look at the rates. It was established in the early 1970s, and it wasn't until 2 or 3 years ago that the first major correction to the pricing algorithm was made with the risk rating 2.0 approach. And that's 50 years of environmental change, climate change that's occurred in terms of increasing costs associated with damages, increasing exposure. To Jim's point, events happening in places where when we developed, we thought those places were less risky. They've become more risky over time. So we're seeing more damages and more occurrences in those different places. But that really is the combination of that development and environmental change that is happening, persistently over time, slowly sort of increasing the frequency, increasing the severity in places where we have invested, lots of money in terms of infrastructure, in terms of development, in terms of property. And that's starting to manifest itself on the maps that we're seeing here, but it's also starting to manifest itself in the insurance industry, where we're really starting to see the insurance industry be the first mechanism to price climate into a lot of our property markets. The real estate market is probably feeling it first, but to localize it back to your question around Florida, I mean, Florida is situated kind of as a bullseye on this insurance bubble map that we've created around wind. And I don't think that's much of a surprise to anybody on the panel. I think even if we are seeing shifting patterns, it still is in the center of sort of the exposure when you think about the intersection of development and climate risk.
So building off of that, and you talk about pricing in climate, right? So climate change risk, Jeremy. We just talked about insurance. What about downstream of insurance? What are the effects on things like real estate values and other things that are connected, all interconnected throughout our economy that tie back to this kind of risk?
Yeah, when we started to look at this last year, also another report that we put out was really focused on population responses to climate risk. I think a lot of the national narrative was that people are moving to risk. They're moving to Florida, they're moving to California, they're moving to Texas, areas that we know have high levels of risk. But we were also seeing contradictory information come out from the Redfin study, for instance, that showed that if you expose people to climate information in their housing search, they start to systematically look for lower risk properties than people that weren't exposed to that information. So that, we in our study, we said, well, let's localize the residential mobility, what we were referring to as kind of migration patterns, to within metropolitan areas, within counties, within states. And ultimately, we ended up finding out that about 85% of all moves annually occur locally. Only about 15% of moves occur across states. So when you start to think about the moving to risk idea of people moving to Florida, to Texas, to California, we're only accounting for about 15% of all moves. When you start to look at the hyper-local moves, we were finding that people are starting to respond to flood risk. And we put a paper out at the end of last year. We wrote a report around it. We found that about 3 million people have already moved due to the flood risk in their communities, oftentimes moving to places in the same metropolitan area, but with lower risk. And as that happens, communities not only lose people, but they start to also take on a different composition socioeconomically, sociodemographically. that has downstream effects for lower demand in the area, if not just directly related to the fact that people are moving out, there's less demand for property. So you end up seeing property value decreases. And then downstream of that, that impacts then the commercial viability of the community and the tax revenues. So all of these things are kind of tied into a larger pipeline of climate risk, and how climate risk is not just the direct exposure of any given property to wind risk or to flood risk, but it's also the indirect impact on the larger community, and how that indirect impact is already starting to be seen in clear statistical signals attached to population change, property value decreases, tax revenue decreases, and commercial viability.
So, today we're talking about hurricanes. Usually when we think about hurricanes, we're talking about like a major hurricane, a Cat 3 or Cat 4, Cat 5, the impact that they're going to have. But to Carrie's point and Jim's point that they were making about the physics and how much extra precipitation these storms are bringing ashore too, Jeremy, and I know you've looked at the different intensities of events, whether it's going to be those kinds of, and we talk about return periods of 1 in 100 or 1 in 500. Those are the rare major storms. But what's the greatest influence that you see, particularly through that flood signal, is it from those really rare intense events, or is it from the less intense but more pervasive events that are causing flooding on a wider scale?
Yeah, that was a good point too. I think Jim made the point earlier that all this is happening as we're seeing sea levels rise. I mean, some of these contributors are slow eroders against property values. They're nuisance kind of quality of life impacts. And I think what we're seeing, to borrow from the economics literature, these economic stressor events, things that are occurring every 5 years, every 2 years, are much more impactful on property values and on population shifts than the big impactful events. And oftentimes that's because the big impactful events have insurance backstops that help to come in. They oftentimes come with federal disaster declarations. Money comes into the community, and we oftentimes see a rebound from those events, from the big shocks after a few years. The health of the market is important. In really healthy markets, places that are thriving, places where people were being drawn into before the event, the rebound is much faster. In places where the market's not quite as healthy, it can be one of the disamenities that drives people out of the area, similar to lack of jobs, maybe poor schools, whatever else may be a disamenity in someone's eyes. This is just another thing that happens in the community and can help to drive down property values and population. So to answer your question, really, we're seeing the strongest effect from those stressor events, those persistent kind of nuisance events, the more quality of life events that end up impacting areas frequently.
Okay, thank you. And we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to get over to some of the questions we have coming in, some of that are about tropical cyclogenesis and rapid intensification and all the kind of stuff that Jim and Carrie we can sink their teeth into. Before we pivot to those, I just want to make one more as more of a comment, I guess, more than anything. But thank you, Molly. Perfect timing there too. So one of the things the kind of information that we're talking about today, it's also playing into the business world right now, because there's been a lot of movement on climate reporting regulation and climate risk disclosure, both for the banking system to protect the U.S. economy, and also through the SEC to protect shareholders that are investing in publicly traded companies. So there's a number of these. You see some of them listed here. Some of them are federal. Some of them are from the state of California. Some of them are in the European Commission as well. So as this climate reporting is becoming more and more prevalent, this kind of asset-specific information that we've been talking about today, that's been created through the research, on the shoulders of the work that Carrie and Jim and the scientific community have done, and as we've integrated these at First Street, just let everybody know, if you are joining from the business community to the webinar today, that these kind of information products can be made available to help do this kind of reporting, and these kind of impacts that Jeremy was describing just moments ago. With that, let me we'll go back to some of our technical questions, and let me go to Carrie first to talk about tropical cyclogenesis, and I'll go to Jim to talk about rapid intensification. So Carrie, you had mentioned before in your method of planting seeds of hurricanes, and you said, yeah, most of them don't grow. Could you speak a little bit about that cyclogenesis, but what it takes to actually grow a hurricane in reality and in your model?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question, which I think most tropical meteorologists regard as one of the great, more or less unsolved problems in the science. How do they form? And there's a question about what controls their long-term statistics. Where do you see storms form in a statistical sense over a long period of time versus trying to forecast when a particular event will form for the sake of making a good weather forecast? They're two related but somewhat separate problems. And from the forecasting point of view, we've known for a long time that a lot of storms, many storms in the Atlantic, perhaps most of them, originate in or kicked off, if you will, by disturbances have completely different characteristics, like African easterly waves that come off the African continent every summer in a steady stream. And most storms form from them. But we also have come to understand recently that they are probably controlling where and when storms form and not if they form, because in models we can take them away, these easterly waves, and yet we still get more or less the same number of hurricanes. So there are two schools of thought about this. One of them is that the statistics are really controlled by the large scale environment, the ocean temperature, atmospheric temperature, humidity of the atmosphere, how winds change with height. And if you know what those are in a statistical sense, you can more or less predict the statistics. That's why we think the random seeding works pretty well. But as to the physics of how individual storms form, that's still under much discussion and the subject of a lot of research. For example, we're beginning to understand that the interaction of infrared radiation with high clouds may be a big player in the formation of these storms.
Yeah, well, we had multiple questions on that, so there's a great interest among our viewers today too on that same subject. So thank you, Carrie. And we're talking about storms getting stronger, and they seem to be getting stronger even faster. So now I'll turn to Jim. If you've got any comments about what was often called rapid intensification, if this is something that is, if you think there could possibly be links of this to climate change, or is this something that's just naturally occurring?
Yeah, the idea of rapid intensification, and generally it's something on the order of 35 miles per hour in a day, or there's various thresholds set, whether it's by the National Hurricane Center or just the scientific community. But there certainly is quite a bit of evidence, and it's all fairly recent, that the rapid intensification events are increasing in their frequency. And again, it's a proportional thing, right? It seems that we always have to pull the genesis uncertainty out first, right? Which is really a problem, by the way, just to digress for a moment. I mean, the insurance companies and most measures of risk are going to look at things in terms of how return periods might be changing. And you can't do return periods without frequency. So we always have this weakness to everything we do. We know that if you get a storm, it's more likely to do these things, but that we just really need to figure that one out. And we've been trying for a long time. But I think that yeah, again, it's the number of factors that are being affected by climate change with rapid intensity change, proportional number, part of that. And there's been some very solid recent work that shows that it's very unlikely that these are not being impacted by climate change.
Very nice. Thank you, Jim. And Jeremy, we have a couple questions related to insurance coming in. I'll paraphrase a couple of them. Basically, as Carrie was mentioning, insurance rates are going up. We're quantifying it better, so insurance rates are starting to go up. The expectation might be that as insurance rates skyrocket, that people will start to move away from the area. But people, I think you had mentioned too, Jeremy, people still keep pouring into Florida. So this might be more of an opinion at this this point, Jeremy, but when would you expect to see the impacts of this rising because your swings in population that we kind of touched on some today, but we don't see, what was termed climate abandonment areas in some of your previous work. We don't see a rapid expansion of that, like across the entire state of Florida, for example.
Yeah, we're already starting to see impacts of increasing insurance rates on asset valuation and changes in property values. People understand, they're made aware by the fact that oftentimes a signal that the insurance is so expensive, and they'll negotiate at the closing table, around the added cost. It'll lower the cost of transaction. Oftentimes that makes its way into the property value statistical signal. So people are, as they are becoming more aware, they're making sense of it. I think for new home buyers, having this information, having risk priced properly, allows them to go in with their eyes open. If they know what the risk is, if they know what the costs are going to be, what they should be expecting moving into the future, that's kind of what you want in the market. You want people to understand what the risk is. You want risk to be priced properly. The biggest problem, and Carrie alluded to this earlier, is that we're making a correction now on this, what I've referred to before as like a climate debt in this space that we haven't paid out yet, right? Where there are people that bought a home, they signed a 30-year mortgage, they understand what the mortgage payment is, the principal, the interest, the taxes, and then they have an initial insurance estimate around the property, and all of a sudden the household economics are being skewed because their insurance is going up, and they didn't sign up for that when they signed the 30-year contract around the property. It's those individuals that are already in their homes that are starting to see the spikes on the property. That's where the issues that we're seeing currently around the insurance issue is, and we're hearing more anecdotally than anything else that people are self-insuring, and in some cases people are defaulting on their home, and they're moving away from the property because they can't afford the monthly home ownership cost. Again, it's more anecdotal. It's not a clear statistical trend. What we are seeing is property devaluation in areas that have seen these spikes in insurance. So people are responding to it. They're responding in different ways. There's no problem with wanting to live close to the coast if you know what you're getting into, if you know what the risk is, if risk is priced properly, but that we have to make sure everybody's aware of that risk, and having property level risk statistics and integrating those into the risk transfer mechanisms like insurance is one way to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And I'm always amazed by how quickly markets respond to availability of new information. And as we've been talking about today, the fact that, given the science that we have today, given the ability that we have to do this risk modeling, that we can actually create these kinds of financial loss estimates that are useful, and the market is immediately responding to these. So it's going to be very interesting over the next years to see how this comes together. So I do see we're about out of time. So first, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Jim Cosson, Dr. Jeremy Porter, Dr. Carrie Manuel. Thank you for a very, very fascinating discussion today of hurricanes and financial risk. For all of those viewing online, we will be making the recording of this discussion available, and we'll also be sending out links to the kind of national reports that Jeremy had mentioned as well. So with that, we will close today. Thank you very much for your interest. And again, thank you to the panelists for a wonderful discussion today. Appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody.